you?
I'm very well. How are you?
Awesome. Thank you. Let me first introduce Dr. Beau Lotto, who's been in a neuroscience research field for over 20 years. Wrote one of my favorite books on neuroscience and perception called Deviate, the Science of Seeing Differently. If you hadn't read it yet, it's fantastic. It's great mind-bending type of stuff. Good complement to Fear is Fuel. So make sure you get both of them. And most impressively, I think, a 3-time main stage TED speaker. That's really impressive. And that Cirque du Soleil one, if you guys haven't seen one, he did one in conjunction with the Cirque du Soleil, and it is incredible and, as designed, awe-inspiring. So, Beau, first question before we get into sort of the neuroscience and stuff. 3 TED Talks, super impressive. I don't know anyone else has done that many. What's your most popular moment, either for you or for the audience, in all of your TED Talks?
Okay, so the last TED Talk, it was particularly powerful to be on stage with the wonderful performers of Cirque du Soleil. That for me was a highlight, and I think that was possibly one of the better moments for the audience as well.
So, Beau, let's get into uncertainty. Everybody is sitting at home, sheltering in place, sequestered because of the novel. And for those of you who are familiar with the definition, novel just means new and unknown. And the novel coronavirus is just that, new and unknown. So it's creating uncertainty. But what is uncertainty and what is reality? It's not what most people think of them by definition, is it?
So, well, there's a couple of questions in that, I suppose. So what is uncertainty? Uncertainty is actually something that we experience all the time. I mean, everything that your brain does is, well, at least almost everything your brain does is an attempt to reduce uncertainty. So uncertainty is basically the inability to predict what's going to happen in the future. And that has been part of our evolution since the very beginning. In fact, it's fundamental to the evolution of any living system. If you couldn't predict during evolution, you were selected out. So the better your brain is able to predict, the more likely it is able to survive during evolution. And so the consequence of that is right now, people are experiencing that tremendous sense of uncertainty, the inability to predict what's going to happen. And your brain then goes into a state, potentially a state of panic, right? It goes into stress because it realizes that when I was in this state before, the chance of dying was actually increased. So your brain is basically saying, well, do anything now to actually increase certainty, right?
And so that part of the brain is obviously the amygdala, the limbic system, the fight, flight, or freeze response. Can we override that uncertainty and that feeling with our prefrontal cortex, with the newer part of our brain?
Yeah, that's a very good point. So first of all, that sense of fear is actually a very good idea, right? That's not a pathology. It's a very natural feeling to feel that sense of angst, anxiety about being in that state, because that feeling is actually enabled us to survive in the past. So first of all, it's not a pathological feeling. The question is, what do you do with it? And there are a number of different responses. One response could be simply, what your brain is telling you is get away from wherever you are now, in a sense, right? It could be go anywhere, just away from where you are. If there was a lion coming at you, that might be a really good idea, right? So just to leave from wherever you are in any direction. Another strategy is simply just to stand still. So we're all familiar with the deer in the headlights, right?
The freeze response. The
freeze response. Because sometimes that's actually a really good response, because you don't know if your next step is going to be over the cliff, right? You just don't know. So the best response is just to stand still. There's another response where you can actually take agency and decide where you're going to go, right? Decide how you're going to deal with it. And that's where you can activate and engage your prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex is the front part of your brain. As you say, it's one of our newest evolutionary structures. And what the prefrontal cortex largely does is it inhibits the other parts of the brain, right? So what's interesting about the prefrontal cortex, and we actually have a new slogan coming out, which is just activate your prefrontal, right?
Mm.
Engage that part, engage in your behavior intentionally. Be proactive rather than reactive. So we can actually use the anxiety, we can use the fear to then decide what we're going to do with it. And again, that's what's activating your prefrontal cortex, using that. And when we meditate, that's effectively exercising that part of your brain. Mm. Because what attention, people think about attention, there's a tremendous amount of research on the neuroscience of attention, what we attend to. What's interesting is that what's powerful about attention is not what you look at, it's what you look away from. Mm. Because what you look at is obvious. We've evolved reflexively to look at things. So when people are finding themselves in a traffic accident, and so often the accident's in the other lane going the opposite direction, and you're wondering, why on earth am I stuck in traffic?
Everyone's slowing down, right?
Yeah. Why are all these cars in front of me slowing down? And the reason is because they're all looking, right? Yeah. It was called rubbernecking, because we evolved to look. Now, next time that happens to you, try not looking and feel how hard it is to not look.
Yeah.
So what people are doing now is, in some sense, they feel like they're having conscious free will, but they're not. They're just reflexively looking at the obvious. They're looking at the things we evolved to look at. They're looking at the increased numbers of deaths. They're looking at the news almost habitually, almost addictively, right? Yeah. To not do that is what's hard. To not look at the obvious is what's hard. And that's what's engaging your prefrontal. And that's what, again, what meditation is helping you to do, is to look away from the obvious. Because your brain is like a muscle. You use it till you lose it. Right?
Yeah. Well, one of the things I talk about in the book, in my book, and part of the platform for dealing with fear and using it as fuel, is research done by Kay Tai and Anna Beiler when she was at MIT, on valence, and the fact that we make these subconscious shortcuts, which are deciding if something's good and rooting it to one hemisphere, deciding if something's bad and rooting it to the other hemisphere. And those subconscious shortcuts are that knee-jerk survival reaction. So we can't avoid those thoughts. We can't avoid thinking that, but we can avoid acting on them and saying, stop. Now I'm going to engage both hemispheres of my brain. So meditation is a great way to do that. Breathing, I suggest something called a 4x4. Breathe in for a count of 4, hold it for 4, out for 4. And when you're feeling, the effects of cortisol and DHEA and adrenaline and all that that's released from the amygdala. But what else do you recommend, and how do you suggest people deal with this long-term uncertainty as we all sit at home here thinking about it?
A great question. In some sense, we're all asking that question. We're all looking for that answer. We're actually starting a series of experiments to address that question. In fact, so people can actually, and people who are watching now, they can actually be part of those experiments, and then we can give that data back to them, find out what actually are the strategies that you can use right now to deal with this uncertainty. But one of the hypotheses, and it seems to be true, is proaction rather than reaction. Most of our behavior is reactive. Something happens and then we respond to it. And this is at the most basic level, like you're talking about, reflexive, but even at the cognitive level, we will react to something that's already happened. And of course, there's an element of choice in there, because you can decide how you're going to react. And how you react to something actually determines the meaning of that something for your brain. Because what your brain's interested in is not data. All the information it's receiving from the world is just data, and data is meaningless, right? Even the light that falls into your eye is inherently meaningless. It conflates multiple things about the world. It conflates size and distance. It conflates something that's loud and far away will generate the exact same stimulus as something that's quiet and up close. But your brain has no access to that physical world. So it generates its perceptions of behavior according to its history of what it meant for its behavior in the past. So you're always seeing and feeling and believing according to that history of past meanings. Well, how you choose to respond to something will determine the meaning of that information, not the information itself, but the meaning of it. And it's that meaning that then gets encoded in your brain. And that meaning becomes part of your future past. So how you respond now will become...
Wait a minute, say that again slowly, Beau, because I think some people, that might be a new concept, your future past.
Your future past. So if everything your brain is doing up to this point is a consequence of your history of your past perceptions, how you saw something in the past, your past meanings, your past responses, then what you do now will become part of your future past. So how you respond to something, you might have no free will in the response, right? In some sense. Yeah. But what you can do, you can't change the thing that happened, but you can change the meaning of the thing that happened. You have control over that. And in doing so, you'll change what you will do in the future when you engage with something that's not dissimilar.
Because you're using those prior beliefs as a prediction for the outcome of the current event. What
you're doing now will become part of your future bias, your future assumptions. And that you have control over, right? So one can therefore be proactive in their engagement with uncertainty and not just reactive. So we know, for instance, that we can put people in different states of power. So I can get you to imagine, so this is research with someone who's been working with me for a very long time, Richard Clark. And we can put people into a state of disempowerment. I get you to imagine a time, and now you don't have to imagine, now it's just happening. A time where you were very stressed and felt out of control. Versus another time when you were stressed but felt in control. And when you feel stressed and out of control, what we found is that the illusions that I've made actually increase. You use context more, but you use it indiscriminately. You become more gullible, right? You become morally judgmental. You actually become a more extreme version of yourself. If you're liberal, you become more liberal. If you're conservative, you become more conservative. Why? Because
if you've been primed to be in a weak state.
To feel disempowered, which is what many people are feeling right now. Yeah. So you become a more extreme version of yourself, right? Because you're going to a place of familiarity, right? But what's beautiful about uncertainty in some sense is that it's actually possibly the only time we actually have true sense of choice. Because you can do the obvious, but you can also choose to not do the obvious, right? If everything's happy and everything's wonderful, there's only really one thing you're going to do, which is you're going to keep doing what you were doing before. Why would you not, right? But it's when things are really difficult and uncertain that now you actually have a choice. You can do the obvious. You can go to fear, and often from fear to hate or fear to anger. Yeah. Or you can go from fear to curiosity, right? Fear to generosity. So another thing people can do, and we found, is that, and we're actually doing experiments on this, is not just be proactive in your own life, and but also be proactive in the service of others. So when you're actually, when we know, for instance, that we will endure more if you're doing it in the service of someone else than you're doing it for yourself. Yeah. So in our experiments, again, with Richard, when the lab was in the London Science Museum, we would subject people to pain. It didn't hurt them, but we put their arms in very cold water, and you have this sense of burning. It's not hurting their skin at all. But people would keep their arms in the cold water longer if they felt it was in service, if this experiment designed so that actually everyone else won, than if they did it for themselves.
There's some great studies as well, if people are interested in this, by Abigail Marsh, who's a professor at Georgetown University, and she's proven that courage, in a sense, what you're talking about, the proactive choice and engaging the SGACC, the courage center of our brain, is much higher when you're motivated by altruistic ideals. So doing something for your family, doing something for your community, doing something for your friend. Yeah. So I love the idea. It's stellar to hit on this, Beau. I love the idea that in this moment of uncertainty, we can choose to do things in service for others when we have that opportunity. Yeah.
And that's activating your prefrontal again. But also it comes back. So in some sense, by doing it for others, it ultimately comes back to you, because in some sense, every behavior is selfish, you could argue, right? The question is, how many people do you affect positively or negatively in your behavior? So if, for instance, you're being proactive and you're being proactive in the service of others, that can actually lower your cortisol levels, because you now feel empowered. You feel, okay, I have agency in the next step, right? I have agency in what's going to happen now.
And for those people who don't know agency, it just means you've got control. You're accountable.
You have control.
For it. So that's agency is the scientific way of saying
yes.
that. Yeah.
You feel you have some level of determination of what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Right. And when we feel that sense of control, you actually feel less uncertain. If you're feeling less uncertain, it means you're prepared to actually adapt to what's going to happen next.
So you're adapted. We've adapted to be able to adapt.
The brain is adapted to adapt, right? This is not the first time we've experienced uncertainty. Again, we experience uncertainty every time you open your eyes. This is a fundamental thing of what it is to be alive. What people are, in some sense, discovering, some maybe for the first time, is that this is fundamental to everything that we do, which is often why we design our systems to diminish uncertainty, right? Think about the success of Uber. One of the reasons why Uber is successful is not simply because you can order a taxi easier or faster. It's because they tell you when the taxi is going to arrive.
Yeah.
Right? So if you're on the street corner, you're waiting, it's like, shit, the taxi,
wait for a taxi.
I'm late for a meeting, right? Well, maybe not now, right? But at some point. But if I say, don't worry, it's going to be there in 5 minutes. What's more, I'm even going to show you where it is.
Yeah.
Your cortisol levels stay low, etc. And what's the significance of cortisol levels staying low? There's a tremendous amount of research showing the deleterious consequence of chronic levels of cortisol.
Sure.
It diminishes your immune system, right? So your ability to fight off the virus decreases. If you get ill, high cortisol will increase the magnitude of the illness. So by being in service of other people, you will actually facilitate, or rather, you'll facilitate your own immune system.
And better wellness in general, yeah.
You will feel better. Your cortisol will better. So it's actually, in some sense, in service to you, which is, of course, you want to be authentic in it. Otherwise, the dissonance will actually create the stress itself.
Yeah, exactly. So, Beau, you talk, you've got a great concept I love in the book as well, about going from one spot to the other. So some people are uncertain. They might be feeling like fear, cowardice, anger, and they want to go from point A to point B, which is courage and confidence and certainty. But it doesn't really work like that, does it?
No, it doesn't. Though we will tell ourselves that maybe it does. So there's a couple of concepts within that. So the first thing is that if ever you want to go from A to B, your first step is not B, right? Your first step is to go from A to not A, right? Because what do I mean by that? So if you get a stimulus, your brain will generate a perception, a behavior and a perception, and that's grounded in your history, but not just your history, the history of your family, the history of your culture. In fact, much of it, your evolutionary history. All of that's encoded in your brain. So most of your life actually happened without you there.
Yeah.
And what that history gives you are your biases and your assumptions. So your stimulus comes in, and just like a reflex, you'll generate perception of behavior according to those biases and assumptions, many of which you inherited. Okay. And those assumptions and biases keep you alive. They're essential for your survival. As you were saying earlier, they are the sort of unconscious reflexes. Just as when you go to the doctor and he or she hits your patellar tendon, your leg goes out. Same thing for perception and behavior, right? Every time you take a step, you have hundreds of assumptions that the floor is not going to give way, that your legs aren't going to give way, right? They're essential. The problem is they also constrain what we call your space of possibility, right? So the only way to see differently, to adapt, is to let go of those assumptions and biases, which is
tough to do.
It's hard to do. And there's a number of reasons why it's hard to do. But that's to go from A to not A. First, you have to let go of those biases and assumptions to be in the unknown. So nothing interesting, or very few things that are interesting, begin with knowing. They begin with not knowing. which is why I begin all my talks saying, I want you to know less at the end than I think you know now. Right? But I want you to understand more.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Which comes on to actually, we think, another hypothesis for what you can do now, which is understanding. But we can come to that. I think that's another potential therapeutic for dealing with uncertainty right now, is to seek understanding. Not knowing, but understanding. But anyway, so to be in not A is to be in uncertainty. And that's the only place you have the possibility of actually expanding your perception. Right? And in order to do so, to step into not A, to step to uncertainty, you have to have courage. And in fact, what we're particularly interested in is not confidence. We're interested in courage.
Yeah.
So in our education program, our focus was not confidence. To do something with confidence means you know what's going to happen next. You're not uncertain. But to do something with courage means you're doing it knowing that it might fail. And that's far more interesting. But you also have to be able to know what your assumptions and biases are, but we almost never know what they are.
Yeah.
Right? And the best person to reveal them to you is usually not you. It's usually someone else. Which is why expanding your perception requires humility. Right? The willingness to say, I don't know. Right? And to
That's
celebrate
a tough one
things.
for a lot of people, huh?
It's a tough one for a lot of people, but fortunately your brain also gave you a space to do that. And science is actually one of those spaces. And it's not science, it's anything that is creative, right? It seeks the unknown, right? Science is not actually about answers. Science is about iterating to better questions, right? Finding a good question is really hard.
That's it, yeah. And having the curiosity too. So I've started a whole series of tech companies throughout my career before I got into the neuroscience research. And that was one of the things we'd spent a lot of time in. What is the right question? How can we change this? I actually, one of my favorite stories to tell audiences is I fired some guy because he did this twice. First time I gave him a warning. Second time when I asked him why he did something, and he said, because that's the way it's always been done, was time for him to hit the road. But finding the right questions to ask, and then exactly what you're saying, having the courage, being uncomfortable or being comfortable, feeling uncomfortable, right? Getting into that space of the unknown leads to a tremendous amount of success in almost all fields.
But there's actually a way to engage with it where you're absolutely right, that it requires that courage. It requires that sense of being uncomfortable. But there's also another way of actually engaging with it where those feelings don't even arise in the first instance, right? So we typically see uncertainty and conflict as a bad thing. And as we're experiencing, of course, it can have very serious, significant consequences, the unknown. But there's also a way of engaging. Now, I'm talking beyond COVID-19. I'm thinking about uncertainty in general now.
Yeah.
If you are interested in understanding, if you're interested in expanding your perception, in empathy and compassion, right, then actually you seek uncertainty. You want it. You feel excited to be there because now you realize this is the only place I can be if I'm going to expand my perception. And again, if you expand your perception, what does that mean? I literally mean in the sense of expanding your mind. You increase the connectivity of your brain. You have more degrees of freedom to think. When Dave Strudwick and I were doing the education program, we called it the agility of thought, right? Why is that useful? It's because when you're confronted with uncertainty, you have more directions to move from. If you're only on a line, right, this dimension, I can only go towards or back. But if I'm on a plane, I can go towards, back, or to the right or to the left. And if I'm in a cube, I can go up and down, right? You become more adaptable. And if you feel more adaptable, you actually will thrive more. You'll have a better income. You'll have better relationships. You'll actually live longer. You'll be more optimistic in the face of crisis because you feel better able to adapt to the unknown.
Yeah, there's some great research as well around, and neuroscientists refer to part of that as novel seeking, finding the unknown, finding new things. And there's great research around extreme athletes who do things that are risky, that are novel, being much healthier and in much better shape, not because of the sport that they do, but because just what you're saying, that mindset of adaptability and seeking
Yes.
uncertainty is
Yes.
is hugely powerful.
Yes. There's another really important part to that, though, which Rich and I were working on a project we were working on with intolerance, the neuroscience of intolerance, and how to facilitate toleration towards openness. And when we think about openness, we typically think about, as you're describing, where someone's open to new experiences, right? And that's a really important point, right? You need to be open to a new kind of experience. You need to be open to the possibility of uncertainty. But we're also exploring that maybe there's also a second kind of openness, and maybe it's even more important, which is the willingness and ability to let go of what you thought you knew before. So, right? So you can have someone who's super open. I'm going to experience the world, all kinds of things. But very quickly they come to a judgment, and that judgment will never shift. You are always X. You know, I was very happy to meet you, but now you're X, and you will never be other than X. Right? Yeah. There are other people who are maybe more introverted. They're less willing to experience all that novelty, but they're more willing to let go of what they thought to be true already. Right? So in that sense, you can have, I'm in the UK right now, in the southwest of England with my 3 gremlins, and normally based in New York, but you can have very conservative guardian readers, right? But you can also have very liberal telegraph readers, i.e. people who are willing to shift from wherever they are, wherever they start, but they're willing to move. And you have some people who are not willing to move.
And so in the, one of my big recommendations is always replace judgment with curiosity. And it's so difficult to do, but once you find that habit, once you go in and you start recognizing, I encourage people to take a journal for a week for every time they come to a judgment. And oftentimes I'll say, when you walk into Starbucks and you're like me from a Irish Catholic blue collar Boston neighborhood, and you see some guy who looks like he's a victim of a drive-by piercing, instead of saying, God, what a freak, you say, well, what can I admire about him? What's really interesting about that guy? And you just feel your whole perception shift, and the way you interact with that person changes. And it's just simply recognizing a silly bias that somebody else populated into your subconscious. So that it brings me another question. I want to ask about the understanding in a second, but before I do, parents and kids especially, we're populating our children's database because they didn't choose what language they speak, the color of their skin, their brothers and sisters. So their idea of a tribe is specific to where they're born. And those subconscious decisions and judgments are all based on, the first 15, 18 years of our life, and prefrontal cortex doesn't develop until early 20s fully. But what can either parents or children or teenagers or adolescents do to consciously think, how do I get away from wanting to be right, wanting to stick with those prior beliefs that were given to me, and open themselves up to more experiences?
Yeah. Well, first of all, the parents in some sense don't have to do very much at all, because kids come into the world with that. Right. We often teach it out of them.
Ah, interesting.
Right. Because I recently did something for a television series, and it was on child development. And my background is in neurodevelopment, how the brain develops. Having said that, one of the best people that people should look into when it comes to the teenage brain is Sarah Jane Blakemore, brilliant neuroscientist who was at UCL, is now at Cambridge, and a good friend. So, and she's done some great work with Uta Frith and on her own. But so the brain comes into the world, and James used to think, or we used to describe that it's bumbling mass of confusion. Right? That's what the baby is seeing and the child is seeing. What if it's not that, though? Because to be confused suggests that there's an expectation. But in order for that baby to survive, it has to actually reach out into the world. Because your brain only makes meaning by physically engaging with the environment, because your brain needs feedback. If you push something, it falls over. Your brain then learns, right? And So what if the brain actually comes into the world with the desire to explore, right? And this is actually in our recent research on the perception of awe and wonder. We're wondering if instead the child's brain is actually full of awe and wonder, not confusion. Why awe and wonder? Because when you feel awe and wonder, you feel small but connected to the world. Your ego diminishes. Your tolerance to risk increases. Your need for closure decreases. These are all the findings that we recently did with Cirque du Soleil, which the third TED Talk's about. That's exactly what you would need if you're a young animal or a young human who has to actually make sense of the world by physically exploring it, to actually step into the unknown. So what if they actually come into the world with the desire to do exactly that, but then we impose on them our need to diminish their risk? We say, don't do that. We try to mitigate risk for them. So what I suggest with parents, and what I've tried to do with my own 3 gremlins, and they're 18, 19, and 21, beautiful people. Yeah, they're wonderful. Is the concept of the sandbar. Okay, what if and I'd say this is not only true for parenting, but I think it's true for love in general, or even for friendship. The sandbar, and actually comes back to what we were talking about earlier about being in service of others. So I say to my kids, I'm not your boat. I'm not going to take you out of the water and take you to the other side because you love swimming, right? So you're going to be in the water. You're going to swim. We're down in Devon, so we're near water here, right? You're going to be out in the water. You're going to swim the waves and all this, but you're going to get tired. So you can come back here and stand on the sandbar. You can rest. You can still feel the waves. You can still feel the water, and then you can swim again. And you're going to get strong enough to eventually you're going to swim to the other side, but I'm never going to let you drown. So what if love is about enabling people to take risk rather than preventing them from taking it?
Yeah.
And creating that context for risk taking. And that's where we talk about safe. And that's what science is. That's what play is. That's what all these, and we would argue that play and science is nothing other than play with intention, right? But
and that's what great startups are as well. Like, culture in a great startup allows failure, actually encourages failure. You know, you hear that fail forward all the time, which I don't like, because if you're failing, then you should be learning, you know?
Yes. If it's a well-designed experiment. A poorly designed experiment is a failure because you learn nothing from it, right? But life is an experiment. So it's creating that space for the person you love, your young person, to take that risk, to get that feedback, to engage. And it's sometimes so hard to do.
And one of my theories as well is parents who have tried to protect, you've heard the term helicopter parents, or what I call bulldozer parents, making the path as smooth as possible. They've done a tremendous disservice to a whole generation because they haven't learned coping mechanisms for stress.
No.
Because the stress is taken away, their schedule is planned from piano lessons to practice tutoring to speaking Mandarin, and they don't have any time to either get in difficult situations, get bored, get stressed, and then try and come up with coping strategies for that. And that's done a tremendous disservice. And that's one of the things I'm adamant about too. So I love I love the sandbar analogy. It's a great way of putting it.
And I think that's true also, not just with kids, but I think in romantic relationships, in friendships, right? I think this is what it is to care for another person, is to look out, to enable them to take that risk, to not let them drown. But
and in order to do that, the key thing, I think, Beau, in order to enable that is letting go of being right. Because if someone's taking a risk that you don't agree with, you want to be right and tell them that what they're doing is wrong.
That's right. And that's so hard. There's a number of reasons why that's so hard, right? The first one is we don't want them to be hurt.
Yeah.
Right. So, but imagine, and for those who have young gremlins in their life, we all know the experience when they're starting to run and they're just, they're this high off the ground. They're starting to run, right? It's
not going to end well.
and you can see their head is going over too far because, of course, maybe people aren't aware. But when you run and when you walk, you are falling. Yeah. Your brain is a constant state of falling. That's what you're doing.
You're catching yourself. Yeah.
You're constantly, you're in a dynamic equilibrium where your brain throws itself forward, throws the body forward, and saying, I'm out of balance. And then the feet try to keep yourself from falling forward, right? So they're trying to figure what that dynamic balance is. And we all know when that head gets a little bit too far and it's, you know, it's on the pavement, you think, oh my goodness, this is going to be awful. Now, imagine if at that point, every single time you said stop, they would literally never learn how to find that point. They're looking for that point, and they can only find that point when they've gone over it, right? So there's that element. There's also the element of trust, right? To trust that once they find that point and go over it, that they will learn from that and be able to not go to that point before. Next, right? So there's element of trust. And of course, young people, anyone loves to feel that sense of agency and trust that, again, that they're in control.
And they're getting better. They're learning how to learn, which is also
and they're learning how to learn.
Yeah.
And then, as you say, they're learning those coping strategies. They're learning how to make those decisions, right? So we also, but as you say, we often impose our own bias and assumptions. Why? Because they worked for us. We think, well, first of all, we don't know we have them, right? As I was saying before. Often we don't even know that we're doing it with assumptions or biases, much less that we have them, or much less what they are, right? So we then impose them. Why? Because, well, we behave as if we have an objective view of the world when we don't. Our perception of the world is subjective. But nonetheless, we think, well, it worked for us, so therefore it must work for you. So
or it took us so much pain to get to that point where we finally realized it. We don't want our kids to have to go through those 5, 6 levels of pain. We're going to shortcut it for them and say, here, let me take away the pain. Here's the way you should do it.
That's right. And of course, we should also be able to learn from other people's experience. It's not to say that we have to go through every single experience. Otherwise, culture itself would never evolve. Right? So we can also learn from the experience of others. But yes, we have to be aware that we have to let them develop their own biases and assumptions and not just inherit ours. And then engage with them with questions rather than answers. And this is generally true in any conversation that is engaged in conflict, right? Imagine what would happen when we're engaged in conflict, which I define as engaging a situation that's different from what you expect. You're now in conflict, right? And instead of engaging that with an answer, you engage in that with a question. Because everyone makes sense to themselves. They just don't make sense to other people, right? And it's because they have their own set of bias and assumptions. And if you knew what that was, their behavior would actually probably be quite rational, given what those beliefs and assumptions and unconscious biases are, right? They just don't make sense to you because you have a different space of possibility, because you have different bias and assumptions, because you have a different history. So you try to reconcile the behavior given your set of bias and assumptions, many of which you inherited. So to know someone is to know why they're doing it, not what they did. And that requires a question.
And that questioning is a great, my shortcut way of describing that, particularly to my kids, or before I had kids, to my employees, was you might be broadcasting on a crystal clear 98.7 megahertz out on the radio, but someone else's radio is tuned in to a different frequency. So they're not hearing the message that you're sending out, and you've got to ask them what channel they're on. And that's a primitive way of saying the same idea. You've got to try and figure out what's important to them. It's a spectacular notion as well. You mentioned a second ago, Beau, about understanding is a potential coping mechanism. Tell me about that.
So again, this is actually a research that we're starting to engage in. So it's a hypothesis, but it's based on some empirical evidence. We have some pilot evidence that suggests this might be true. But that understanding something, and what I mean by understanding is not just knowing a fact, right? So you can put stuff on the table, and you can say you can know how many things are on the table. That's not to understand the situation. That's just to know the situation in some sense. You know the facts of it. To understand it is to know why they're there, but to know why they're there in a way that enables you to predict something else in the future. So understanding something, E equals mc squared, right, enables us to predict situations that we haven't yet experienced. Okay, it's a principle that transcends context. And so understanding is getting at those principles that help you take what you know in one situation and apply it to another. Right? That's what artificial neural networks are doing. That's what your brain is doing.
Yeah.
Your brain has evolved to try to find these principles. And the better able you're to find principles that transcend context, the more you're able to adapt to new contexts in the future. So we think that that might feed back to your sense of wellness, your sense of ability to sit within uncertainty, because you will feel that you're better able to adapt to new situations, because a new situation is not necessarily, it's an opportunity. You'll be able to flex, you'll be able to be agile, resilient. But if you learn a rule that applies only to this situation, change the situation, you're going to be selected out. Right?
That's a great.
And so I think, so Rich and I have been exploring the idea that this is the basis, this might be one other mechanism by which the brain deals with uncertainty, which is to seek understanding. And an understanding that transcends you. It's not just your own personal lived experience understanding, because we actually know that that can be very far away from an understanding of how to engage in the world. That's
a great thing to end on, Beau. I know we've gone well over our half an hour, and it's fascinating. We could keep talking for a long time, but any last sort of bit of advice or anything else you wanted to point out? And then I've got one final question for you.
Any piece of advice? I mean, other than what I've said already?
Anything I didn't ask you?
Not at the moment. I don't have anything else to add at the moment.
Okay, last question.
Yeah, last question.
Last question. What was your favorite book as a child?
What was my favorite book as a child? There were a couple, but one of them was Curious George, actually. I love the Curious George series.
Perfect.
I know. And my dad called me a monkey when I was the nickname. So, but I love the Curious George, and the other was Where the Red Fern Grows.
Was what?
Where the Red Fern Grows.
Oh yeah, that's one of my favorites too.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah.
Right.
So my dad got me Carl Sagan's Cosmos.
And did that just sit by the side of your bed?
I love the principle and I love the physics. And Carl Sagan is an inspiration. I mean, his ability to engage audiences, engage them in a meaningful way, is just truly inspirational and was truly inspirational. But those three were, I think, my favorite.
Beau, I certainly know, and I'll recommend it again for everyone out there. You are able to engage people in an incredibly inspirational way yourself.
Oh,
if you haven't seen that Cirque du Soleil TED Talk that Beau did on the main stage, go look at that now.